You need to have an operating company. You need to have proof of work. You need to have enough money at basis to show that you can sponsor the individual and pay their wage.
That's Matthew Hellrung, co-founder and partner at Meltzer Hellrung LLP. He helps companies create scalable and compliant immigration programs that withstand audits and policy changes. With over a decade of experience, he's a trusted advisor to Fortune 500 companies and HR leaders for his expertise in I-9 compliance, global mobility, and visa sponsorship. I'm Marie-Lynn Germain, the host and the producer of the Dear Human Resources podcast. Today, in this episode, Matthew is going to talk about what HR needs to know before sponsoring that next work visa. Welcome to the show, Matthew.
Maria, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Are there specific industries or professions where employers most frequently sponsor visa applications?
It's actually across, several different industries, and I would say it's less about the industry itself and more about the type of position companies are sponsoring. So you see, work visa sponsorship in transportation, professional services, consulting, software development, marketing, healthcare, technology in general. But more so, you see most of the sponsorship in STEM or science, technology, engineering, and math positions. So these are your consultants, your engineers, your software developers, your doctors, potentially nurses or teachers that are being sponsored for most of these industries.
What are the key legal and compliance considerations HR professionals should be aware of before their company sponsors a visa?
I think it really depends on the type of company that you have and how long it's been alive, how long it's been operating. But at the very basis of it, you need to have a U.S. company in general. It must be incorporated in the United States, in some state across the country. I would say you have to have revenue and funding as a business. So revenue, pretty standard for businesses that are more mature, but for startups, funding is typically how we assess whether a company has the ability to sponsor a particular work visa. And you have to have enough revenue or funding to support the employee's wage, just like as you would any other employee. From there, an additional component really is proof of work. Do you have the ability to show the USCIS, the federal government, that you have work available for this individual? In alternative terms, you can't bench the person in most cases. For most positions, they must be actively working for your business on something related to the position that you're sponsoring them for. And then I think from there, it's what type of visa are you going to sponsor? There are a number of different types of visas available. Some have prevailing wages, some have location requirements, some have company organizational requirements. And it depends on where the individual's from. For example, individuals from Canada and Mexico are entitled to special visas. Folks from Chile and Singapore, also special visas available. Australians have special visas available. And if you're an international company, you have a secondary class of visas that would be available for the business. So I think kind of summarizing that question, really, you need to have an operating company. You need to have proof of work. You need to have enough money at basis to show that you can sponsor the individual and pay their wage.
So I have a vague recollection from the 1990s where you had to prove as a company that you couldn't hire an American citizen to do the job. Is that the case?
It is not the case for work visas, but it is the case for green cards in some cases, or a particular type of green card known as a labor certification or PERM. But for regular H-1Bs, TNs, L visas, sort of the alphabet soup that exists on the various work visa categories, you're not required to show that there's a similarly situated American or a lack of Americans or citizens or permanent residents to do the job. You simply have to prove that the position itself meets the requirement of whatever visa you're going for in most cases, and that the individual has corresponding education that matches that visa type. So for example, an H-1B, which is probably the most prevalent visa out there, and most people know it's always in the news and in politics being batted around, a little bit of a political football. That visa requires that the position itself be one that requires a bachelor's degree. So that's engineering, teaching, lawyers, doctors, dozens of different positions would qualify. And then the individual themselves has to have that education. So you can't sponsor, for example, an engineering position, which would qualify for an H-1B visa, but the individual, let's say, has a bachelor's degree in English and just a self-taught engineer. That person would not qualify. But there is no requirement that you prove as a U.S. business that there are no other workers available to sponsor. That's strictly in the green card realm.
So even if they've worked for the largest companies in the world in their home country, but don't have that bachelor's degree in that area, then they would not qualify for a visa.
For H-1Bs, TNs typically, L visas are a little different because they're intercompany transferees. O's, which are known as the Genius visa, there's not a requirement that you have a bachelor's degree, but generally you need to have a significant amount of experience in exchange for a bachelor's degree, usually at least 12 years
I see.
thereabouts to qualify for an H-1B. But it's not a requirement in every visa category. Typically, the H-1B and the TN visas, which are most prevalent in the United States, those generally do require a bachelor's degree.
What's the easiest visa to get?
That's a good question. And I think it depends on where you were born. So right now, I would say the easiest visa that we process that it is to get is probably for Australian nationals or something known as an E3 visa. And if you're an Australian national and you have a bachelor's degree and you're being hired for a position that requires a bachelor's degree, and be outside of like account management or sales, you can probably get an E3 visa pretty quickly. There's supposed to be a cap on these visas, but to my knowledge, I don't think the Department of State even counts them. There's no publicly available information that the E3 cap has been met. You can sponsor them all year round. If individuals are coming in from Canada or Mexico, the TN visa is probably the easiest one to get because you just have to be a citizen of Canada or Mexico to qualify. And obviously, there are position and education requirements like H-1B visas that are also important. For folks coming through school, a lot of people think that sponsorships are just people found abroad and brought into the United States. But in most cases, for our clients, the individuals are students that are in school already on a student visa, and they traverse through their student program, graduate, and then end up on what's called OPT or optional practical training. For those individuals that are through that path that are not Canadian or Mexican or Australian or Singaporean or Chilean, an H-1B visa is going to be the primary path of transitioning, and you have to go through a lottery to make that happen.
I just want to ask you one more question about the visa for Australian nationals you
Sure.
just mentioned. Is that limited in time? Is that 6 months or a year or renewable type of thing?
You get 2 years of status or approval each time that you are approved, and that's renewable indefinitely. Just like TNs are renewable indefinitely. H-1B visas have a max out, so do L visas, which dictate you have to usually sponsor the person for a green card. O visas also renewable indefinitely in 1 year increments. So you don't necessarily have to sponsor these folks for green cards long term to avoid these max outs, but E3s, TNs, O1s are renewable indefinitely. And it's a great status to be on, especially if you want to be in the United States temporarily. If you're not really sure if you want to stay here or be sponsored for a long-term permanent residency.
Interesting. I wonder if it's a copy of what Australia offers. I understand that there are some visas that Americans or other nationals can get to stay and work in Australia in particular fields that are in high demand. And it's fairly easy to get, I heard, and it
Yeah.
gives you about 6 months or a year where you can
Yeah.
easily work there.
Interestingly enough, there are we call reciprocal visas available. So the U.S. typically enters into agreements where they will reciprocally offer a particular type of visa. Now, it might be a different name, but it's generally the same type of visa and authorization, and that's negotiated by the countries. So, if we're granting an E3 visa for Australians to come to the United States, there is a corresponding and reciprocal visa for Americans to go to Australia. And that's typically like the reciprocal nature of these visas, at least under the treaties that we're signing. So TNs and E3s.
How can HR leaders assess whether a candidate is a good fit for visa sponsorship?
It's hard to answer that question without taking a step back and saying, when businesses come to us, clients come to us to ask about visa sponsorship, really is, what is your policy about sponsoring work visas for positions? We generally will say, if you're not having trouble finding good talent or filling positions, immigration might not be the best tool to spend money on, amongst the other tools that are available to HR leaders and people ops folks. But if you are having trouble sponsoring or finding people, sponsorship is a way to kind of fill the top of that funnel, that recruiting funnel, in a way that could be productive for acquiring new talent. So I would say the biggest thing to think about when you're sponsoring visas or individuals is think of it programmatically. How are we going to offer this as an employee benefit, just like 401k or health benefits, for example, health insurance or death and disability benefits? Step back and look at it programmatically and say, where are we having trouble sponsoring or finding folks, if it's engineers or software developers. And if we could offer sponsorship in that particular position or that department, would that increase the quality of the applicants we're getting? The volume of applicants we're getting. That's typically what you'll find. So I think from there, the big problem or the issue becomes: are you properly screening folks during your interviews? Are you training your recruiters to ask the right questions about immigration sponsorship? And from there, do you have counsel available to review these individuals when they do indicate that they need immigration sponsorship as part of your interview process? We, for clients, review every single person that indicates they need immigration benefits as part of an interview process with all of our clients, because we want to assess those individuals to make sure that there is a immigration benefit or option available if they do accept that offer. And if there's not, then we help recruiting teams be more efficient in saying, if this person's on a work visa or it will terminate soon and there's nothing else we can do, not a good fit for this particular position for this company.
Matthew, what are some common pitfalls or delays companies face in the visa sponsorship process, and how can they avoid them?
I think it hit a little bit on the last question I answered, which is training, making sure that your talent acquisition team understands basic visa sponsorship. They don't need to be experts. That's what we do for clients as a partner. And then the handoff between talent acquisition and HR to make sure that is really seamless. And then where do you bring the vendor into that? As your immigration law firm, when do they contact the individual? What is the experience the individual has with the vendor? It's largely reflective of the company itself, as we are usually the second person or entity or vendor to touch an individual after they've been hired. So I think you have to think about those handoffs a lot. Secondarily, we talked about it programmatically, not just sponsoring individuals for one-off positions, but looking at the entire thing as a program that you need to implement as an employee benefit. I think the more you think about it that way, from starting the program and sponsoring individuals, the less issues you'll have later on in consistency when it comes to green card sponsorship or immigration policies. Also, I think you should think about cost. You're going to internalize the cost. Immigration is more expensive than hiring a legal permanent resident or a U.S. citizen off the street sometimes. And there's ways that you can cut that depending on how you run a program. But there is additional cost essential as part of running a program like that. And have those costs been approved by HR leaders, other department heads, other executives, so that they're aware, again, as you're implementing a program, there is going to be some costs and operational debt essentially to run the program internally that people should consider. And then I think finally, choosing the right vendor. Do you have the right firm for the right size of program that you have? Oftentimes we'll have clients that chose the biggest firm in the field, and that's amazing. They have a great brand and they provide great service. But if you're not like Apple or Meta or Google, you're probably not going to get amazing long-term service from such a large vendor, because they're more focused on enterprise level clients. If you're an individual or a smaller mid-sized business, you might be better served by a middle market vendor that still considers you an important client and does a great job, but you're more in their top 20, 30, 40 clients versus like their thousandth client, for example.
So before moving forward with a sponsorship, is there anything organizations can do internally, prepare for it, if you will, like, I don't know, timeline, documentation, and then, as you just mentioned, cost expectations? And how much does it cost a company to sponsor an employee?
Depending on the size program that you have, this is not required, but establishing a point person is really important. Who is going to be the person that interacts with the employee when they request immigration sponsorship as part of the interview process? Who is going to interact with the outside vendor, the law firm? How are documents and information transmitted back and forth as part of that process? As you mentioned just now, what are the timeline expectations? We often find that the hiring manager is really excited about this amazing, AI engineer, and all of a sudden, I want them on next week. Well, and they're on an H-1B, for example. Next week's not possible.
Yeah.
It's impossible to onboard somebody that fast. So setting those timeline expectations of, we move fast as a business, and so do a lot of other providers, but it's going to take 4 to 6 weeks, maybe 8 weeks from offer acceptance to when that individual can join and assume that position. So timeline is really important. Usually, I think HR and talent acquisition sort of know this, working with a vendor for a long time, but educating the hiring managers on when that person's going to be able to show up on their team, I think that's super important. As you mentioned before, cost. Something else I think I want move back to the handoff between talent acquisition and HR and how that's done to make sure that the individual feels safe moving into the new position. And there may be accelerated costs sometimes with people that want to be on board faster or use something called premium processing, which a lot of H-1B transfers will dictate in order to remove the possibility of falling out of status as they transfer over. Timelines, costs, as you mentioned, the handoff in between both talent acquisition and HR, and then making sure that hiring manager is really aware of what the timeline is to get that individual on board.
What kind of budget do we need to look at?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the visa that you wish to sponsor. There are some visas that maybe cost you $2,000 or $3,000 total, and they're good for 2 or 3 years, and perhaps renewable indefinitely. H-1B visas, there's filing fees with the government, and there's attorney's fees as well on top of that. So you're probably looking at more like $5,000 or $6,000 every 3 years. I think that what we do when we take on clients, especially those initial sponsorships, you must also be mindful that foreign nationals want, in most cases, permanent residency. If I was in that position, I would want permanent residency as well, and ultimately want to become a citizen, support myself, my family in the United States. So the work visa cost up front, $2,000 or $3,000, maybe 5 or 6. If it's a complicated one, maybe $8,000 to $10,000 for something like an O. And I think that's pretty. And you're going to find vendors that are a little bit below that and a little bit above that, certainly, depending on the size that they are. But that's an upfront cost. Thereafter, you should also think about green card sponsorship, because every time you sponsor an H-1B employee or a TN or an O or an L employee, to get them to the United States, get them work authorized for your business, the next question is going to be, when will you sponsor me for my green card? What is the policy that the business has on green card sponsorship? Is it good performance? Who needs to approve it? What are the additional costs associated with that? Now, it's not usually right away, but in year 2, 3, or 4, you will start to incur those green card costs. Ultimately, you don't have to as a business. But the flip side of that is, if you don't sponsor individuals for green cards once you do the work visa, you may lose that person in a few years because they will move on to an employer that will sponsor them for a green card eventually.
Can a candidate offer to pay for the fees?
It depends. Sometimes, yes, but it depends on the visa type itself. For H-1B visas, generally no, although employees or sponsorships can pay for the premium processing component. It's less clear for things like E3 visas, TNs, O1s, for example, both for the attorney's fees and the filing fees. It really depends. Generally, as a firm, we say that the employer should cover most, if not all, of the costs of a work visa sponsorship. One, it's sometimes or most of the time required for certain types of visas, but two, it offers a little bit of investment, right? What you're doing is you're investing into this individual, into their work visa, and there's a bit of an unspoken agreement between the employer and the employee that we're spending, $5,000, $7,000, $8,000 to sponsor you. I think it shows goodwill on the employer side to pay a lot of those things. Now, we do have clients that have their employees pay most of the filing fees and attorney's fees for the visas where it's available. However, I would say that, and this is anecdotal, but I would say we see more turnover, in those employee populations because of that. So I strongly encourage employers, understand the cost, be aware of the cost, allocate budget. Spending that money, it really is kind of a social contract between you and the employee. There's also other things you can do, right? Compare it to salary, compensation, stock options, bonus. There are other ways where you could perhaps subtract cost or compensation in some of these other areas to make up for immigration sponsorship, which certainly is an additional cost.
I understand that when you get a visa, it is tied to a particular employer. Is that correct?
The sponsorship itself is done by the employer, and technically the employer owns that sponsorship, where it's H-1B or TN. But you can transfer those visas to other employers. You just have to find another employer that's willing to cover the sponsorship. And that's some of the downside of spending $5,000 or $6,000 upfront for H-1Bs or TNs or E3s, the other different types of visas that are available, is that yes, if the employee does not have a good experience at your company, they can eventually transfer that visa to another employer. Now, another employer has to assume the cost. There's still the qualification requirements of the right job, the right education, the right visa classification, but that's possible. And so I want to be clear, it's both good and bad for employers to allow employees to transfer their visas to other new employers. But there's a couple, including Ls, which are intercompany transferees from abroad, where that's not possible. You actually have to work for an entity related to the conglomerate at all times.
Matthew, we are in 2025, and in light of the current political landscape in the US, do you see a drop in the requests for visa sponsorships?
We haven't thus far. Trump won and gave us what we thought would be a pretty good playbook to things that would happen. Now, some of that's happened. Certainly, the Trump administration's gone after students on F1 visas, J1 visas, things like that. We thought we'd see a significant spike in requests for evidence, challenges, denials for the million or so, several million visas that are filed each year. We haven't actually seen that to date. Now, knock on wood, it may be coming, but I think we're seeing a lot more of a focus on undocumented immigrants in the United States right now, and less a focus on folks that are on work visas and permanent residency. Now, certainly there are people that get caught up in ICE raids and things like that, which is terrible. But employment-based immigration, for the most part, has not really changed significantly under Trump too, which is surprising to honestly the entire immigration community. Now, they are recommending some changes, in the coming months. Like there's some chatter around raising the prevailing wage for certain types of visas. There's a chatter around the H-1B lottery, and perhaps it may be changed next year or the year after to be more merit-based. But for the most part, I do think that folks inside the Trump administration now are realizing the value of employment-based immigration, and the fact that a lot of engineers, a lot of folks in the STEM fields in the United States are immigrants or children of immigrants. And we need those individuals to compete, the global race for AI and clean tech and electric cars and space. Those all require really smart people. And the United States does not have the market cornered on smart people. And I think that's something we've done very well over the last several decades, is attract some of the brightest folks from around the world to come live and work in the United States. So we haven't seen a significant drop. Now, the other aspect here is maybe AI, right? How much is AI affecting engineering roles, software development? I think you've seen some of the large tech companies start to lay off some of the lower level software developers, data scientists. But we saw this happen in 2022 as well, as sort of the venture-backed market that employed a lot of people in startups in tech dropped out completely. And, there was almost no venture funding to be found for quite a while. And we saw a lot of layoffs. But interestingly enough, we saw the market take up a lot of those folks that had really great STEM talent into middle and small market businesses that were, previously probably not competitive for that type of talent because of the salaries that venture capital and the large tech companies were paying. So I'm optimistic. We have not seen a drop in sponsorship. Long term, there's a lot of students. F1 visas are really important to U.S. universities and to innovation here. The stance that the United States is taking towards immigrants in general, I think we've seen more recently is from the Department of State numbers that came out for F visas, that it may deter people long term from coming to school in the United States and then thereafter getting OPT and moving to TN, E3, H-1B visas. So this may be something that affects us 3, 4, 6 years from now. But at the moment, sponsorship's been strong, and there really haven't been a lot of the worst effects that we have thought would happen under a second Trump have not happened yet, surprisingly.
The golden visa Trump talks about, is that a wish list or is it real?
Right now, it's a wish list. So there's something, this is not something new. We have something called the EB-5 program, where individuals can drop, $1.3 million into U.S. businesses, create jobs, and get a green card through that program. That's existed for a decade or more, maybe 20 years. The golden visa is something interesting. I think it's $5 million, and there's no job creation or investment. You just give the government $5 million. I have to think of the two programs. If there were so many people lining up, so I think they quoted 250,000 people just lining up for these golden visas. Why are they not in the EB-5 program as well? It's actually cheaper. Sometimes it could be less paperwork, for example, right? So we already have a program that sort of does this, and you can argue the merits of whether it's worked well, if it's done what Congress intended it to do. But I have to think logically, if I can pay $1.2 million instead of 5, I'm going to pay 1.2 to get a U.S. green card. Now, there's maybe some more administrative burden and paperwork, but that's what you pay attorneys for. You're going to have to pay attorneys to file the golden visa as well. It also would take an act of Congress, in my mind, and in my opinion, to authorize this type of golden visa, or at minimum, a rulemaking process, which the USCIS or Department of Homeland Security would have to go through this prolonged publishing of a rule, comments, reviewing the comments, then publishing it to the register. That's going to take a while, 9 to 12 months minimum. So I think right now it's a dream. I'm interested to see if they actually go through with it and Congress does pass something like that.
Sounds like a media ploy to me, but anyway.
Yeah.
This was fascinating, Matthew. I learned so much, actually. I thought I knew a little, but I knew nothing. So thank you very much. It was great having you on the show.
Thank you, Maria. It's a pleasure being here.
Support for this show comes from Western Carolina University, a campus of the University of North Carolina system, with the technical assistance of Kelly Minnis.